the specifics of plan, the details of plan, really enabling a more in-depth discussion that's more sophisticated. It forces us to decide between similar policies that enable us to get gradations of difference between them that are significant and educationally beneficial. There's also the argument that every counterplan must be plan inclusive to compete. Like the NFA-LD rules say that a counterplan must attempt to solve the problem area of the affirmative. So at that level, the counterplan sort of has to involve some mechanism similar to the plans, at least it's in its approach to a problem area, in order to be competitive. Like if I've got this counterplan that uses nothing similar to the plan, then there's not going to be any sort of competitiveness between the two of them. Okay, so questions about general counterplan questions, I guess is how I'm labeling that section. Okay, so let's talk about status for a second. There are 3 statuses of counterplans that have emerged in varying order of argumentative responsibility. They are conditional, dispositional, and unconditional. A conditional counterplan is one that the negative can kick at any time. They can say, I don't want to do that anymore, I'm done with it, and cease their advocacy of it immediately. Slightly more argumentatively responsible is the dispositional counterplan, which says if there is offense on the counterplan, that is, if the counterplan is turned, then the negative can kick it, which, like if there's a disad linked to the counterplan or a turn on the net benefit linked to the counterplan, then the negative can kick it.
Not kick it.
What?
Not kick it. Like when they turn the counterplan, you're not allowed to kick it. It's on the
right. Okay. And then there's unconditional, which is there are no circumstances in which negative may cease advocacy of the counterplan, and if they do, they're dirty, rotten liars. So, obviously, I think the most problematic of those statuses is conditional. That is, because it enables the most argumentative irresponsibility, because it forces the affirmative to debate in multiple worlds at the same time, because it can't predict where the affirmative is going to go. And that this is distinct from kicking a disad or a case argument, simply because it's an advocacy. It's something that changes the focus of the round and changes the comparisons made in the round. A 1AR comparing plan to status quo is fundamentally different than a 1AR comparing plan to counterplan. So for the negative to be able to just go out of all of that decision calculus and that comparison is fundamentally unfair. Then there's also the question of like argumentative responsibility. That are people allowed to make advocacies that they don't intend to follow through with? Which is, I mean, a sort of mushier ethical question, but I think is still useful in arguing for and against conditional counterplans. That people are responsible for the arguments they make and the words they say, and to allow people to sever out of those arbitrarily seems to encourage that kind of argumentative responsibility, that people can just throw arguments out there without any consideration of how they're going to function, or how they're going to influence the rest of the round, or how they're going to influence strategy. And that's, I think, pedagogically and also ethically dysfunctional. But there are a lot of justifications for conditional counterplans that have been employed with fairly good success. The first is that it depends on the conception of the counterplan you employ. If the counterplan is an opportunity cost, then kicking a counterplan is fundamentally no different than kicking a disad. There is literally no reason why the counterplan is a special breed of disadvantage that somehow forces the negative to stick with it. It's just another negative argument, and all negative arguments are functionally conditional. Another sort of justification is that the negative doesn't really ever advocate anything. The negative's only responsibility is to indict the plan, and that doing so through a competitive counterplan, doing so through a philosophical justification, doing so through a combination of disadvantages. All of those are the same, and any one of them is sufficient to guarantee a negative ballot. the fact that the counterplan becomes unworkable is immaterial to people who subscribe to this theory, which is broadly described as negation theory. There's also the argument that conditional counterplans improve strategic thinking, that you're forced to argue in that the 1AR is forced to make strategic decisions based on the idea that the counterplan might go away. If I can editorialize for a second, I think that's a crafty way of saying we're screwing the affirmative and that makes them think harder about how to get out of the screw job. But again, it's an argument that's been deployed with some success. That strategic thinking skills force affirmatives to be smart in their rebuttal choices, to not front load on the counterplan or spend too much time on the counterplan because they can predict negative collapsing based on the status of the counterplan. It forces them to make more strategic choices and be, I guess, more selective in how they engage the arguments being deployed. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of the same arguments that are deployed against conditionality can be applied against dispositionality. The only exception is like the answer to the sort of time skew arguments or strategy skew arguments is a little more complicated. Because essentially dispositionality allows the affirmative to pick whether or not the counterplan is conditional. They can go straight defense on the counterplan, and then they're going to be stuck with it. So if it's a dispositional plan inclusive counterplan, for example, it could be strategically viable to make a straight defensive strategy against it and just argue that the superior solvency of the case is the better policy option. And in that case, the negative is stuck with this non-solvent counterplan. So the negative argument in favor of dispositionality that's unique to dispositionality is it enables the affirmative to pick the negative strategy. Whether or not that's so, I think is a question that this forces the affirmative, if they want to ensure a consistent advocacy throughout the round, to not make their best arguments against the counterplan, I think is, and can be argued is still the same kind of argumentative irresponsibility and attempted ground skew as the conditional counterplan. So nothing to see here. Also, as just a general sort of overviewish remark, I think that the structure of NFA-LD is far, far, far too short to run conditional counterplans. You do not get the chance to deploy a complicated strategy when you have two speeches. If you are wasting time with a 1NC fleshing out a counterplan that you are kicking to go for anything but theory, I think you're making a fundamental mistake, and I think that you're doing a disservice to not only strategic thinking, but also to the educational value of the round. The time constraints are so small that any time you're wasting with an argument like a counterplan that you don't intend to go, especially an argument as sophisticated as a counterplan that changes the 1AR so dramatically, is a disservice to the activity. But I mean, that's just in a world where there's only one set of rebuttals. I think it's a far more complicated question in a world where there are two, which isn't this one. And then unconditional counterplans are relatively theoretically incontrovertible. No one really says you can't run a counterplan unconditionally, except to say that you can't run a counterplan in general, or you can't run that specific type of counterplan. So yeah, relatively incontrovertible. If you want to run a counterplan but don't like theory debates, you should probably run your counterplan unconditionally. So let's talk briefly about a couple of sort of problem counterplans, which have their own set of theory behind them. The first one, which is probably going to be pretty big on this topic, is consultation counterplans. And